Tim from the Mouse Castle here. Before we get started, I want to ask you a huge favor. Please nominate the Mouse Castle Lounge for the People's Podcast Awards. We're not usually in the habit of chasing awards, let alone asking you to go out of your way to back us, but these are prestigious awards. They've been around for 11 years, and they recognize the best in online media. Even more significant about the People's Podcast Awards is that final nominations are based largely on the support of podcast listeners and fans just like you. You get a say on who makes the final cut. If you're a fan of the Lounge, if you enjoy conversations with Disney historians like Jim Korkis, J.B. Kaufman, and Jim Fanning, filmmakers like Pamela Tom, Sarah Colt, and Don Hahn, and artists like Dave Avanzino, then please cast your vote for us. It's very simple. Just visit podcastawards.com and enter the Mouse Castle Lounge in 2 categories, People's Choice and Society Culture. Make sure you include our URL, our web address, themousecastle.com, click Submit, and you're done. That's it. Okay, if you want to vote for your favorite podcasts in other categories, you can do that too. But make sure you nominate the Mouse Castle Lounge. Get your nominations in by April 30th, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. Thank you so much for being a part of Team Mouse Castle. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to the party. You found the Mouse Castle Lounge, the place to be for good times and great conversations from the world of Disney. The bar is open, your table is waiting, and drinks are now being served. Come on in. And now, here's your host, the keeper of the Mouse Castle Lounge, Tim Calloway.
Welcome to the Lounge. It's April 17th, 2016, and I'm Tim Calloway. Do you think you've got what it takes to be a genuine Disney historian? My guest, Jim Korkis, is going to let you know. But first, become part of the history-making Mouse Castle by liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Mouse Castle. Follow me, Disney Tim, on Twitter, and of course, check out the Mouse Castle on Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can share your questions and comments with us by emailing podcast@themousecastle.com or call our listener line at 702-475-5MCL. That's 702-475-5625. And also, please visit the blog at themousecastle.com where you can download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app for your mobile device. Just click the pic that says, get the app. So you want to be a Disney historian. A lot of people aspire to the title, even though it doesn't pay well, if at all, and pretty much no one is going to hire you to fill the job vacancy of Disney historian. Still, it's a noble field with many esteemed names, a number of whom it's been my pleasure to welcome to the Mouse Castle Lounge. Jim Fanning, Sam Gennawey, Didier Ghez, J.B. Kaufman, Jeff Kurtti, Todd Pierce, and Paula Sigman Lowery. And those are just the people who have contributed to Jim Korkis' new book, How to Be a Disney Historian. It's a collection of tips, tricks, and anecdotes about the world of Disney history research. It's an incredibly useful and informative book, even if Disney history isn't your thing, because there's plenty of great advice about writing and research in general, regardless of your particular topic of interest. Jim Korkis is a great friend of the Mouse Castle Lounge, and it's always a pleasure to have him on as my guest. The lengthy list of Disney history books Jim has written include The Book of Mouse, Secret Stories of Walt Disney World, and 4 volumes of his Vault of Walt series. Today, Jim shares with us his best advice on how to become a Disney historian, what separates the contenders from the pretenders, and he and I tell our own real-life stories about how to make an interview go horribly wrong. Please welcome Jim Korkis, my guest today in the Mouse Castle Lounge. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the lounge, Jim Korkis. Jim, how you doing today?
Hey, Tim, thank you so much for having me back to the lounge. And I see you've done some renovations, and the craft table is now stocked with chocolate and, some fruit-flavored waters. So, hey, great. Always glad to be back.
We have a few tasty beverages, too, and we put a new coat of paint on the wall, so it's looking good. How to be a Disney historian, tips from the top professionals.
Right. And actually, maybe the title of the book should be, Why Would You Ever Want to Be a Disney Historian?
And that was my first question, actually. Why would Actually, what I really want to know is there are a lot of Disney historians out there. Why do we need a book like this right now?
Okay, because again, there are a lot of people who are calling themselves Disney historians who perhaps are doing a disservice to that profession, and the fact that there are a lot of great Disney historians out there who've been writing for decades, but that's just the problem. They've been writing for decades, and none of us are getting any younger. We need to develop a new crop, and a crop that has some perhaps higher standards, as well as they don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, I invited people to contribute to the book who have been around for quite some time, and because I wanted them to go, how did you get started? You know, because suppose you're somebody up in Storm Lake City, Iowa, or in some town up in North Dakota, and you're going, well, I'm not in Los Angeles, I'm not in Orlando, you know, and, you know, Ward Kimball's dead, you know, who can I talk to? How did you get started, you know, even in the days when there was no internet, so that they know how to get started? And then once they get started, how should they go about it? Where should they start looking? You know, if they're going to a library, what should they be looking for? You know, if they're interviewing somebody, what types of questions should they be asked? You know, I interviewed Ward Kimball several times, and I saw other people interview Ward, and whenever they all trotted out the same question of, well, how did you create Jiminy Cricket? You know, depending on Ward's mood, sometimes he'd be gracious, but he'd still be rolling his eyes. It's like, you know, I've already told that story. I've got a lot of other stories to tell, you know.
I actually had that experience with someone who was on my show previously, whose name I will not mention, because I had heard a conversation at a gathering I was at with this person. And, you know, I wasn't eavesdropping. I just happened to overhear it. And one of the things he said was he wished people would stop asking him the same questions over and over again.
You know, and some of these guys too, and you probably had this experience, because they keep getting asked that same question, they create their own little sound bite, which again is entertaining, and it is slick and all of that, but doesn't add to, you know, the Disney history at all. You know, in fact, one time I got accused of plagiarism because they said, I interviewed such and such, and he said this, and you've taken this word for word. And I literally had to pull out my, fortunately I was videotaped in interviewing this guy, and had to send the videotape and show them that this guy said the exact same thing, word for word, that he'd said to this other person who had interviewed him.
And do you think the internet, kind of going along that line, is both a blessing and a curse? Because for people who have, for historians who have been writing about Disney, as you said, for decades, pre-internet and all that, you know, they had to go to libraries and go to
they had to go through newspapers
and all of that. And now anybody can click on the internet and find information, not necessarily correct information. And to talk about that a little bit, what is, if people are going to begin researching on the internet, what are some of the pitfalls that they need to avoid?
Well, it always surprises me that sometimes the simplest information you need doesn't exist on the internet, and sometimes the most obscure, you know, can be located. Basically, if you're going to start writing, it's important to know what's already been written, so that you know what area has already been covered, what has been discussed. You know, get that broad foundation, you know, and I know that people complain about Wikipedia, and I have too in the past, but Wikipedia is actually a good place to start, to get sort of a rough idea of, okay, what has been said about the Mickey Mouse Club Circus in 1955, you know, but what is the problem with some of the so-called historians, new historians who are out there? That's where they'll stop. You know, they'll just cut and paste from Wikipedia, and it goes, it's on the internet, it must be true, and it's on Wikipedia, you know, and
that is not
and
research.
It's like, no, that's just where you start, you know, and because the people who write for Wikipedia, you know, are as human as anybody else. And I will be honest, I'm a sucker for a good story. For decades, I believed that it was an urban myth that when Walt Disney showed up, to get that prestigious, the highest civilian honor ever given to an American from Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, that Walt was wearing on his
lapel, or
coat,
under the lapel.
Yeah, a vote for Goldwater button.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, Walt will never do that. Even though at that time he was a conservative Republican, he would have respect, and especially in the 60s, would have respect for the office of the President of the United States. And my gosh, this is a prestigious, and you see photos, and, Walt's lapel is clean. But as you mentioned, underneath the lapel, well, a couple of years ago, information was found that, yes, he had a small Goldwater pin. It was actually a drop of water that was gold, but everybody knew that was Goldwater, and it was underneath the lapel. And as he went up to accept his award, he flashed it, but just to President Johnson, and just briefly. And knowing Walt and talking with his daughter, Diane, about that, Walt had a playfulness about him. He was still very much a kid, and sometimes still very much a naughty kid, and so, that's what he was doing. Because again, you're also the president, you own this huge business. You don't want to upset somebody who may be the president of the United States for the next 4 years,
mm-hmm.
right?
But at that point, I mean, he is, Walt Disney, absolutely at the pinnacle
mm-hmm.
of his
mm-hmm.
his career, so he can get away with
tweaking
the president
and
a little
again,
bit
because he did it, and he did it, and Johnson never mentioned it. It's not in any of Johnson's memoirs or recorded. See, because that's another thing you have to do when you're a Disney historian, and you were talking about how you get started, is you don't just go to the usual suspects. You just don't go to the books that are written about Disney. The first source I always go to is Bob Thomas's book, which is great, and we can talk about that if you want. But Walt Disney, an American Original, has never been out of print since it was released in the 70s. It's one of the most accurate books out there. But
mm-hmm.
you've got to go to other sources. So, for instance, in the story we were talking about with President Lyndon Johnson, I went and I looked at the Johnson Presidential Library, and he never mentioned anything about this. So to him, this was just not even a minor incident, not even worth talking about. I've been to the Eisenhower Library to research, because there's a ton of stuff about Walt, because there was a lot of connections between Eisenhower and Disney, and there's a lot of things still there left to be discovered and talked on. So as a Disney historian, it's important for you to go to other sources. And so, for instance, I have a very extensive Disney library. In fact, I even have Disney books in foreign languages and limited editions, things like that. But I also have a section devoted to amusement parks and to animation and all of that, because you can find other information and other names. And again, it's very much like connecting the dots. I always say that Disney history is like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, and every now and then you find these pieces, and it's important for you to share these pieces, because somebody else may have a piece, and once they see yours, they go, oh, well, here's my piece, and you put those things together, and then you go, wait a minute, that sky is a lot larger than I thought, or wait a minute, there was a bird in the sky. And so there's still so many jigsaw puzzle pieces that are missing out there. In fact, this last year I got contacted by a pigeon fancier group, believe it or not, wanting to know Walt's connection with pigeons. And they had gone to the Disney Archives, and the Disney Archives said, well, we used to do pigeon releases at the parks, but we don't anymore. Well, Walt's involvement with pigeons was much more than that, and they said, well, we want to know about the Walt Disney, Pigeon Award. And the archives told them, that doesn't exist. And
I
they
beg
said,
to
yes,
differ.
it does.
And,
That's why we're contacting you.
and the
We're
weird thing
the ones
is
that
as you're
give it
telling me
out.
this, I even know where I could find a story, where I can find it in my own library. I know where this story is. Oh my God, I've got it bad.
You know, and again, you see, and that's the amazing thing about Walt Disney. You know, for crying out loud, you know, the guy, 65 years old, and it was like he lived multiple lifetimes. You know, he was involved in so many different things, and things that we never knew about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think there's a good article to be written about Walt and lawn bowling. You know, he was a champion lawn bowler out in the Smoke Tree Ranch in Palm Springs, and in fact,
I did not know
paid
that.
for people to go to a lawn bowling championship. And it's, oh God! So for those people who are out there who think, my gosh, everything that's ever been written about Walt Disney has already been written, you know, there's still other things, and also even things that are out there, you can look at it from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can take a look at that. Well, what about this? And what about, you know, I just sent in the manuscript for a new book that's coming out this summer called The Unofficial Disneyland 1955 Companion. Because it occurred to me, 2.5 years ago, it occurred to me, oh, we're heading up to the 60th anniversary of Disneyland. It's not the 60th birthday, because birthdays are for people, anniversaries are for things. So we're heading up to the 60th anniversary for Disneyland, and my gosh, I interviewed a lot of these people who worked at Disneyland in 1955. They're not here anymore. You know, they've gone to Walt's big project in the sky. I'll just grab, you know, a couple of snippets from those interviews, and I'll stick them in the book, and my gosh, that'll be an easy book to do, and it'll be fun for people because they won't have heard these stories before. And so again, 2.5 years later, I'm still working on the book because once I pulled out, you know, the snippet of interview, I go, well, I better explain what it is they're talking out here.
You know, and here's a common theme. As a couple of weeks ago, I had Todd Pierce on the show, and he talked about his terrific new book, 3 Years in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
But he mentioned the exact same thing. Is he went into the project as you did,
right,
thinking, okay, I'm going to get this, and this, and we'll quickly put it together. Mm-hmm. You know, boom, and we'll do it. Research doesn't work like that most of the time, does it?
It took Todd, 9-10 years to put that all together. Because again, it's not just a case too of finding the information or even explaining some of that information. You've got to verify the information, you know, and my rule of thumb has always been to try to find at least 3 independent sources. And what I mean by independent sources is you can go on, we were talking about the internet, you can go on the internet and you can see that people have cut and pasted word for word from other sites, you know, and that is so annoying to me when I'm researching on the internet and it's go, oh, look, and there's these other sites that have information about this. So I click on that site and it's like, wait a minute, that's exactly what it was on that other site. Wait, that's exactly what it was. You know, and there's no new insights, there's no new information, so you've got to verify the information as best you can, and some of it, you know, you can't, because some of it is just anecdotal. You know, for at Disneyland in 1955, they didn't have a cafeteria. They had a lunch wagon out behind Red Wagon Inn. It was called Harley's Tent, because Harley was running it, and it turns out that Harley was a bookie, and he was taking bets from early days. You know, and it's like, oh, geez. But, you know, I got told that by a Disney legend, and fortunately, there's still a couple of Disney legends who are left around, who are sharp, and who worked there in 1955, and I was able to confirm from another Disney legend, oh, yeah, everybody knew that about Harley. He says, I placed a couple of bets, you know, didn't win anything. It's like, what?
Yeah. And, and just because a fact is repeated over and over again on the internet does not mean it's true. One of my pet peeves, and I think you and I may have even talked about this in past conversations,
Mm-hmm.
is that quote often attributed to Walt Disney.
Right.
If you can dream it, you can do it.
Right. And you know who came up with that quote, right? Tom Fitzgerald from Imagineering. Yeah, and it was for Horizons.
Mm-hmm.
But you go out there, and especially on some of those sites that are, Walt's quotes, Walt's famous quotes. It's like, no. but it sure sounds like something he would say, right?
Right.
But again, you're right. If you say it often enough, somehow it's like, well, it must be true. And that's why I tell people, don't trust cast members. And I was a Disney cast member. Don't trust cast members, because sometimes they are told something by an older cast member or a cast member who's been there for many years, and it's like, well, he told me this must be true.
Mm-hmm.
No, it is not. I think one of the most frightening experiences I had was a couple of months ago. I had friends who come out, and when friends come out, one of the first things they do is, well, you've got to come to the park with us. No, I don't need to come with the park. Yes. And this time, they wanted to take Keys to the Kingdom. And they said, and we're going to pay for you to go. And it's like, I haven't been on Keys to the Kingdom for years. So, this will be an enjoyable experience. So we're on Main Street, and this very perky female guest relations guide is pointing to the railroad station. And she said, and see, up in that upper window, that's where Walt would sit to look out over the park.
Oh.
And so I bit my tongue, because when people say these things, there's no point in, embarrassing them, and, I don't want to identify myself as Jim Korkis, because one of two things happen. Either people immediately get, intimidated and that, or the thing that's even worse is they have no idea who Jim Korkis is. So,
Yeah.
Well, you're one of those Disney geeks who think they know everything. So in a quiet moment in
We
the
got to
tour,
work on your PR, my friend.
So in a quiet moment in the tour, I pulled her aside and I said, Walt passed away in December of 1966, and the train station didn't start getting built until January 1971. And I thought, that I'm not accusing anything. I'm just, bringing that up for her to think about. And she looked at me in the most condescending way of, you idiot. I can't call you an idiot, but, this was approved. This script that I'm talking from was approved, And it's like, all right, I'm going to. And she had a couple of other whoppers in there, too, on opening day, October 1st, when Roy Disney gave the speech, and I wanted to say, no, that happened 3 weeks later. But again, and I run into, people say, well, you must spend all your time, researching about Disney. I spend just as much time, if not more, trying to put out fires.
Mm-hmm.
All of this misinformation that is out there. The cast members at Walt Disney World created so many stories about the Haunted Mansion that, you don't even know where to begin,
Mm-hmm.
To put a stop to that. And as a Disney historian, it's you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to get accurate information out there, so that there's something that people can access. And it's important that you've researched that information and you've presented it, clearly so that people can see, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about some of your colleagues or the other people that have the other pieces of the puzzle, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You brought 15 authors and historians.
Plus a chapter by Dave Smith,
Yep.
plus the foreword by Leonard Maltin.
There you go. You brought them in to discuss what it takes to be a Disney historian. First of all, when you started developing this project and throwing it out to these various people.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you've got quite a list here. What was the response? What was the initial response that you got?
Okay. Well, first off, when I started, it was all going to be Jim Korkis. How to be a Disney historian by Jim Korkis. That's it. Jim Korkis is the star, and, and fortunately I had that moment of clarity of, you idiot, you always say that nobody can know everything, about Disney, certainly not you. And, how many people have you, known over the years and helped over the years, and they've helped you, who, as we were talking about, have the other piece of the puzzle. So I wrote down my wish list, and my wish list was actually 20 people. And some people turned me down. John Canemaker turned me down, but he turned me down in the nicest, sweetest way possible.
Because that's John
and
Canemaker.
Wished me good
He's
luck
a
with the
very
project.
kind gentleman.
But and very well bred. But again, it was a case of, he was working on a project where he had he needed to concentrate completely on that project, and he had a deadline. There was another person, and I won't mention his name, but was going through family issues, was going through family problems. Those can crop up at the last minute, and actually family problems that dealt with a parent who had gotten to that age that, needed some assistance. And so I had a list of 20, and 5 turned me down. And the other 15, their initial response was, "Why are you contacting me? I'm still learning. There's nothing I can tell people." and so each one, I had to hold their hand and say, "You're pretty amazing, and I've learned a lot of stuff from you. And, one of the things I learned from you was, such and such." "Really?" "Yes." And I said, "Remember what you were like when you were just starting out. Obviously there was something about Disney that fascinated you. Nobody else was writing about it. You couldn't find any information. And so you had to go find the information. And then you were generous enough to share it with other people." I said, "There are other people out there like you out there, but they don't know where to start. They don't know how to go about doing it. And they also don't know what you've learned over the years, that, you should play nice, with other people. You should give credit and all of that." And so that didn't just happen once. As I said, all 15 of them, the initial response was, "I'm not worthy." When they turned in their contribution, each one went, "Well, this really isn't very good. So if you want to edit it, severely, you can, because it's like, no, it's perfect as it is." And, then I also gave them the opportunity, before the book was published, I sent back their thing, because I said, as an author, sometimes after a period of time has passed, you go, "Oh, I wish I had said this, or I wish I'd said this differently, or I wish I had included this." So I gave them all another chance to look at it, and again, it was like, "Are you sure you want to use this?" Yes, yes, yes.
And it's interesting too, because when you propose this to them, you kind of left them to their own devices to write about what they wanted to write about. So in the book, there is a little bit of repetition.
There's repetition, but again, I think it either reinforces a point or gives a different perspective of that same point.
Yes, and also you found that people contributed. They offered it from different perspectives. So you had people who talked about parks, and people who talked about
music and about animation. Because when you say Disney fan, that's a broad brush. There are people who just collect Disney pins, and they consider themselves huge Disney fans, and I think they are. But they have no interest in Walt. They have no interest in an animated feature. They have no interest in, they're only interested in the pins. There are some people who are only interested in parks, and sometimes they're only interested in a particular park, like Disneyland. So, there's that broad territory that you have to cover, and there are some things that are going to be similar, but there are some things that are going to be specific to that area. So you want to bring in as many people who have a wide background of expertise as possible. I'm probably the odd duck when it comes to Disney historians, because I have an interest in all of these areas, and I have an expertise in all of these areas. So when it comes to Disney entertainment, I have a background as a professional actor, as a director, as a producer. So I can take a look at these things, and I've done some of those things for the Disney company. When it comes to Disney animation, I grew up out in Southern California. I had friends who were Disney animators. I tried to become a Disney animator, so I can talk about things like, drawing through a shape or where the line of action should be, and I can understand that, and then, since I understand that, I can communicate that to people who have no understanding of animation. But I'm really the odd duck, because I'm unemployable in so many different areas that I have that. But some of these people, like Jerry Beck is a huge expert on animation. You've got Werner Weiss and Sam Gennawey who know their stuff about theme parks, and Sam, of course, coming from the perspective of urban planning, so he's taking a look at theme parks differently than most people would, and Greg Ehrbar and Russell Schroeder on music. So I wanted to get the widest variety out there, and what was your experience, and if you had to go back in time to talk to your younger self, what would you tell them? And I also think it's important for Disney historians to start looking at other things, because they just keep coming back to these same old stories, and if you never heard the story, it's new to you. So I can't criticize that, but there's so many other stories out there to tell, and Disney history is happening every day. We were talking off mic about Tom Staggs, and how everybody and their mother thought this was a done deal, that he was going to succeed Iger. We all saw it when Jay Rizzullo and Tom Staggs flip-flopped roles a while ago. It's like, yep, this is the golden, and we find out, nope, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, how do you think Jay Rizzullo is feeling these days? My God.
And again, you take a look and you go, well, who in the company can do this? And then you take a think of, well, maybe they'll be pulling from outside the company for that position.
Which is not something Disney typically does. Not to say that they won't.
No, but again, they might. They might look at somebody like Kathleen Kennedy, who's been so successful, running Lucasfilms.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously she's had that background, with a successful franchise there, so an understanding. She's got the contacts. She's well liked. Would you move that in? But then again, maybe she doesn't want to do that, because if she does, then she's removed from the creative process. And some people just love the creative process.
Yeah.
I think John Lasseter had culture shock when suddenly, he was made not only head of Pixar, but head of
Chief
Disney
Creative
feature
Officer,
animation,
yeah.
and then was involved with the parks.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly now he's pulled away from creative aspects to take charge of these administrative aspects. That's the reason Jim Henson wanted to sell the Muppets to Disney. It wasn't that he was tired of the Muppets. It was he was tired of doing all the business stuff. Mm-hmm. Paying the salaries, hiring people, laying people off, trying to make these arrangements for distribution, all that. He wanted to get back to, I want to do some creative projects.
And by the way, for people who are taking notes right now, this is all becoming Disney history.
It is. and not only is this Disney history, but thanks to Bob Iger, we've got a lot of franchises that are Disney history now. So you've got the Muppets, you've got Marvel, you've got the whole Lucasfilm. And again, in another 2 years, as a Disney historian, Tim, when we're on the show talking, I'm going to have to be asking you, okay, what are the creatures in Pandora in Avatar? Can you tell me about these? And, how is this different than, because again, that's Disney history, at least in, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Exactly.
That's it. And so, for those of you who are listening to this, there's a great deal of hope. Tim started off this by saying, do we really need more Disney historians? Well, we need some good Disney historians, to do this. And there's a lot of stuff that, because so much happens, there's a lot of stuff that just gets left behind, that just gets shoved into the corner. We were talking about the Disneyland book. Everybody trots out, the same stories. Walt had to choose between having the toilets working or the water fountains, and so he chose the toilets. And women's high heels sunk into the asphalt and all that. Nobody talks about the fact that the first couple of months of the Jungle Cruise, Walt had live baby alligators. There were live baby alligators in a little pond covered with fishnet at the entrance to the Jungle Cruise, because Walt wanted people to see real animals in addition to the electromechanical ones.
Mm-hmm.
And electromechanical is the term before audio animatronic. And why would he do that? He wanted to show live alligators. And just down the block in Buena Park, they had the Buena Park Alligator Farm that had opened there in 1953 and had actually originally been in downtown Los Angeles. And, you read about the opening day and nobody talks about the alligators, or that the alligators would constantly escape. And fortunately, one of the Jungle Cruise skippers was from Florida, so he could make the sound of an alligator. So he would make this sound, and the alligators thought it was their mother, and they were shouting the sound so they could capture the alligator. Walt had an order for, crown herons and some other exotic birds to put in there, and he was also going to put it in the Arboretum. The Arboretum was the weenie for Adventureland, and it never got built. It was going to be as tall as the castle, and glass with a big sharp spike at the top so it looked, vaguely oriental type thing. And inside would be exotic plants, there would be birds and all that. But as the cost started to rise, something's got to go, and so the weenie went. And now the Disney company says, well, Walt didn't put a weenie in Adventureland because he wanted to create a sense of mystery and discovery. So you wouldn't have that one icon, that one landmark to, it was like, no, he ran out of money. This is what he wanted. This all happened 60 years ago. Nobody remembers any of this stuff,
No, and that's why it's important for people to go down there and do the research.
And I think it's fun. I think the real stories are fun.
Well, one of the things that I like, and I get this from the chapters in the book that you read, but also from Didier Ghez, who is like a kid in a candy store when he is doing research. I have never known anyone who is more enthusiastic about tracking down and verifying the most obscure bit of minutia in Disney history. And it's infectious. He is so excited.
And my gosh, one of the nicest, most politest people in the entire world, but boy, is he persistent.
Yes.
If he gets his teeth into something, he will just not let go. But he is not, a bully about that. And because of Didier, what has happened is we've uncovered so many autobiographies that Disney people have written that never got published.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one coming out in a couple of months on Mel Shaw, but Didier found Jimmy Johnson, who is the guy who created Disney Records in the 1950s and the mid-50s.
The Whimsy Works book.
Yeah, the Whimsy. And gosh, that's such a sad story, is when Johnson was let go from the company, he sat down and he started to write his autobiography. And 2 days after he finished typing it, he dropped over dead. And so the book was just gone. There's this manuscript with all of this information that nobody else knows. And so Didier was able to make contacts with the family and go through this and clear rights. And so that book came out. Homer Brightman, who was a story man, and there's a couple of others that we can't mention because they're still in the process of, you have to get approval from the family and things like that. But that's all thanks to Didier Ghez. And Didier and I were sitting around talking one time, and I said, Didier, I have this great idea for a book. It's called Talking Disney. And it would just be, some of these interviews that I've done with people, but I pitched this idea to publishers and nobody was interested. They said, well, this is a niche book. And I went to Disney. And Disney said, no, because, they're telling stories where, those stories are true, but we don't want those stories out there.
Mm-hmm.
And
they don't jive with the official version.
and so from that, Didier created a much bigger project, which was Walt's People, which not only included my interviews, but interviews from other Disney historians. It's up to 17 volumes now, and each book is like 300 pages or more, and it's all first-hand interviews with people who were there. And what a wonderful resource for people in the future. I wish I had had that when, I was starting out doing Disney writing, because there's nothing better than hearing these stories from the people who are actually there.
Right.
And then because you're getting all these different perspectives. We were talking about getting, 3 different independent sources. So if Ken Anderson is telling this story, let's see if Mark Davis tells that story in the same way, or there's something that Ken was leaving out because he had an agenda or he wanted to look better than he was or whatever, So you can go through these, and you can see how excited I am talking about this. And Tim, I'm always excited to be on your show because I know you have this same passion for Disney, this same passion for Disney history, and it's just so exciting,
It's fun
to talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to go down the list here. We've mentioned most of the names, but I want to make sure we cover everybody. You mentioned, of course.
Let's start with the foreword by Leonard Maltin. Leonard is a good friend. I grew up out in Glendale, California, and that's when Leonard was just starting out. And again, when you have people who have similar interests, you gravitate to each other. So I was there when Leonard was, creating his whole career out of thin air. And the very first book I wrote with my friend and then writing partner, John Cawley. It was called Encyclopedia of Cartoon Superstars, which was entries on all the main cartoon characters from all the, and Leonard graciously wrote the introduction for that. And now here we are decades later, and Leonard is doing this. And yes, Leonard said the exact same thing. I'm very flattered you asked me, but I don't know if I can say anything to people.
And as a side note on that, and I'm thinking part of it is because a lot of us are of a certain age, but I was so pleased to see in your book how many of your contributors referenced Leonard's The Disney Films book,
right,
which is one of the reasons that you and I are having this conversation now, because at a much younger age, Leonard Maltin got me very excited about the whole scope of Disney entertainment because of that book.
Because, again, it was the only game in town. People weren't writing books about Disney up to a certain year. And again, in the foreword, I was able to convince Leonard to tell the story behind, well, how did you start writing that book? Which to me was just fascinating. And some of the older hands in the book, too, commented to me, I never knew that's how Leonard started, And so, yeah, so who are some of the other contributors?
Let's see. Let's just run down the list. Of course, Dave Smith you mentioned, but I'll just run down the list.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Barrier, Alberto Beccattini, Jerry Beck, Greg Ehrbar, Jim Fanning, Sam Gennawey, Didier Ghez, J.B. Kaufman, Jeff Kurtti, David Lajak, Todd Pierce, Russell Schroeder, Brian Sibley, Paula Sigman Lowery, and Werner Weiss.
Right. And again, people should recognize those names. And if you don't, That's one of the points of the book as well. I've already received 2 or 3 emails from people who go, you know, one of the things I liked about your book is it introduced me to a couple of people I had never heard about before, and now I'm going to be looking at their stuff.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And in the book we have a link, you know, to all of their books as well as a short little biographical sketch, so you can understand, well, why did Jim ask these people to be in here? You know, and I will tell you, I was like a kid in the candy store each time a contribution came in, because it was like, I never thought of that. I should be doing that now. Or, gosh, that's exactly what I do. You know, this gives me reinforcement that I'm on the right track, that I'm doing the right things.
I felt the same way. I mean, I've done a handful of interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for people listening, if you do interviews or interested in doing interviews, Brian Sibley and Todd Pierce, their contributions, their chapters have some remarkable advice and tips on how to conduct good interviews. I mean, I was taking notes. It's like, oh, I need to try that. Oh, I need to steal that one. And I was also happy to see that someone who's as esteemed as Brian Sibley has made some of the same stumbles and mistakes that I have. That was that was very reassuring for me.
and again, you know, I don't know if you got this sense from the book, but, you know, didn't want it to be the 10 Commandments. These are just, you know, some guidelines based on personal experience. Take what works for you. You know, not everything is going to make sense to you, or put on a light bulb on the top of your head there. And also, I think the book comes across as fun. So it's not
it's not a textbook. It is very informal, very personal, very much so. And you see your various contributors, you see their personal style and their personalities come through in their writing.
Yeah, very anecdotal, very conversational, and what surprised me was that it seemed like a quick read. You know, every time I kept going through the manuscript, it's like, wait, I'm already halfway through this. What? this all just goes so smoothly. But again, the hope is to inspire other people, you know, and also to help train them in some good habits, and to aim for high standards. But even those people who are not interested in being Disney historians, I feel there's a value in sharing this material so that they can appreciate when they see other things of, hey, this is a good book, and this is a good book because of this.
And whether you're writing about Disney or not, there's just really sound advice in here on doing any type of research, doing any kind of interviewing, or, you know, looking into history and things like that. It doesn't just have to be about Disney.
Right. Related to Disney. And the other reason I wrote this book was I wanted to get in print, so that people could use it as a reference, the history of how all of this started. You know, people take for granted that, oh, well, I can start a website and I'll write about Disney history. There was a time and place when nobody was writing Disney history.
Uh-huh.
You know, how did this happen? How did this evolve? And there were magazines and there were fanzines. And I don't think a lot of people realize that some of the websites that we take for granted now started in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a small group of people. And again, since they were so highly opinionated, they couldn't stay at the same website. They broke off into separate websites so that they could present Disney history in the way that they wanted it presented.
Mm-hmm. Well, Warner Weiss's Yesterland was one of those websites. He started that in the late 90s.
1995, yeah. And in fact, that is why Al Lutz started Mice Age, is because, and that's in the book, is Warner talked to him and he said, you know, you should be having a website. And that's where the Disney Information Guide, DIG, came from, which evolved into, you know, Mice Age and now Mice Chat and all of that. All of these things come from somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, none of it was created in a vacuum. It evolved over time.
And it's out there for people now to use. And I'm glad you mentioned Brian Sibley. What a wonderful guy. All of these are just personally, they're wonderful people, besides being terrific Disney historians. But yes, and many of them write about, when I started, I made this mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe people reading this book can either avoid those mistakes or as happened with you, you go, I made that same mistake. So
I feel much better now.
Yeah. So was there anything in particular about the book that stuck out there for you?
Everything that we have discussed. I'm gonna go back to the interviews, because that's kind of my milieu, and
right.
just the fact of being prepared. And I can say from experience, there have been interviews that I have been very prepared for. There have been interviews that I wasn't, and it shows, and I can go back and listen to it, and I can say, well, I was definitely having an off day there, and maybe listeners to the show will notice, maybe they won't. I do, because I'm my own worst critic.
Right.
One of the best pieces of advice in doing interviews, and I think Todd Pierce was one of the ones that pointed this one out, is be on time.
Yes.
I was 5 minutes late for a phone interview with Pat Carroll, who was the voice of Ursula.
And did she chew your head off?
Let me have it. And so yes, and that was exactly the last time I was ever late to an interview.
Well, I will tell you an interview story. This didn't happen to me. I've had some terrible things happen. Like, I thought I was recording and I had pressed the play button instead of record, things like that. But this is a friend of mine who I asked to contribute, and he wasn't able to, so I won't use his name. But he was writing for an official Disney magazine, and he was writing this quick little personality piece, and so he got set up to interview Ward Kimball over the phone. But again, sometimes, and this with press, sometimes you've only got 10 minutes, you've only got 15 minutes tops. That's it.
Right.
And so my friend has a background in Disney. He's a good writer. He's done interviews before. And so he gets Ward Kimball on the phone, and of course the first thing you do is you gush, I love your work, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, whatever. And the first question he asks is, tell me a little bit about your career. And Kimball blew up, and for the next 15 minutes said, didn't you do any preparation at all? Didn't you do any background? Because again, especially with Ward Kimball, he has a huge background, not just in animation, but in Imagineering with the Firehouse 5+2, his Backyard Train, So where do you start? So asking someone like that, well, just tell us a little bit about you.
Did you even try? Oh my God. Another, I keep going back to Brian Sibley, one of the anecdotes he did, and I think it was an interview he had done with Dave Smith, where he was using a recorder that I think he had borrowed from a friend and wasn't completely familiar with how to use it. And an hour into the interview, he realized that he had pressed play and not record.
It happens to us all.
Yeah, it happens to us all. And of course, Dave and Brian are friends, so that worked out okay.
Because Dave went back and was so gracious enough. He covered the same material that was in that hour that was missing.
My aha moment from that, or my takeaway from that, is I did an interview at the Walt Disney Family Museum a few years ago with Tony Anselmo, the voice of Donald Duck.
Okay. And Tony can get cranky sometimes.
Yes, and he was absolutely gracious and wonderful. But as you would do in any interview with Tony Anselmo, at some point you're going to ask him to do Donald Duck. Okay,
right.
Well, if you've heard the voice and if you've been in the presence of Tony while he is doing Donald Duck, it is not, the voice does not come out without a considerable amount of effort. Okay, right. It is a physical transformation that he undergoes to do the voice. It's not easy. Well, we are about 5 minutes into the interview, and I realized I had not pressed record. And he had done a considerable amount of Donald Duck during that 5 minutes.
I'm glad I was not in your shoes, Tim.
He could not have been nicer. I will say that.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back and we redid it and it came out wonderful. And Tony, if you're listening, I apologize again for putting you through that. It happens.
No, it does take effort to get that voice and to get that voice understandable,
Mm-hmm.
which is a whole nother level. So yes, sometimes he can get cranky when he's asked to do that voice because he doesn't think people realize what goes into that. And it's not just a trick voice of, well, I stick my tongue over here and all of that. He becomes the character. It comes from inside.
Yes.
As it does for most good voice artists. But yeah, no, we could probably do an entire show on all the mistakes we've made during interviews. but again, I think one of the things I regret most about the interviews I've done with people is not knowing enough.
Yes.
Jack Hanna was one of the very first people. He directed Donald Duck cartoons. He taught at Cal Arts. He was an animator. He was a comic book artist with Karl Barks. And, my gosh, what an extensive, So there was plenty of stuff, low-hanging fruit that I could pick. It wasn't until a couple of years after his death that I discovered that he had worked on the commercials that Disney had produced in the 50s to help generate money to build Disneyland. It was a very short period of time, just a couple of years, and it was a side company, and I knew nothing about this. And again, most of the people who worked on those commercials, long gone. And I had this opportunity, and I could have asked Jack about this, and I didn't even know to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And, I kept pushing on some of these other things that it didn't allow Jack to go, by the way, I also did, da-da-da-da. And that's happened with a lot of people, and that's my regret. And as we talk about, people keep asking the same question. Jack Lindquist, just passed away. What a great loss. What a wonderful guy. And again, there were things that he was never asked about. And I know he wrote a book, but he was also working on a second book.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Didier will get a hold of that. So we may see that.
Yeah,
but
there's a partial manuscript out there, definitely.
Yes, but so many other things that he saw and he experienced. And I was talking to this, and I'll call him young because he was 20-something, and to me that's young. When I was 20-something, it's like, listen, I'm an adult. I know what I'm doing. You old people die and get out of the way. I know, But he wants to do a book about Roy O. Disney. And I thought, that's terrific because I feel that Roy is tremendously underrated.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, but I don't know. And I said, I will tell you right now, you're pretty lucky because most of the people who are still around who knew Walt and Roy are always questioned about Walt. They are never questioned about Roy.
It's true.
What did Roy look like? What did Roy eat? Did Roy smoke? How did you see him behave this way? I said, so you've got to go out and get these people, but you've got to get them to talk about Roy, and everybody loved Roy. Everybody loved Roy. Some people were afraid of Walt, but people weren't afraid of Roy. They respected Roy. And I said, you got to get those stories now before they're gone.
Absolutely. Get the stories. Well, once again, the book is How to Be a Disney Historian, Tips from the Top Professionals.
And you can go to themeparkpress.com or amazon.com and find that.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jim Korkis, you top professional, you. Always a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend. We'll talk to you again when your next book comes out.
When the Disneyland book comes out this summer, right?
Absolutely. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that will do it for this edition of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Thank you so much to Jim Korkis for being my guest. Stay up to date with everything going on in the Mouse Castle Lounge. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. You can also download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app, which you can get right now by going to themousecastle.com and clicking Get the App. The Mouse Castle Lounge is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. I just like to talk about them. I'm Tim Calloway. It's been a blast as always, so let's do this again real soon. Take care.